Hi everyone. So, a lot of folks have asked me to make a video where I talk more specifically about my illness and my healing journey and all the stages of that and what that's looked like. So, I really want to do that. I have a written summary of my healing story on my website, which you can look at as well. That I wanted to go a little bit more into depth just because I think it can be helpful for people to hear what someone else has gone through and what their healing progress and healing journey looked like. And of course, although everyone's journey is different, there definitely are some commonalities that a lot of people experience. And so I hope that that is really helpful. So I'll just start at the beginning. I had signs of a compromised immune system from the time I was a baby. I don't know what the origin of these issues were. We tend to get our microbiome passed down from our mother. My mother is in pretty good health, although she does have some symptoms that could indicate she has some toxic load. She has had a brain tumor, and my dad has a lot of allergic type symptoms. I think he may have some type of mast cell disorder, although not nearly as severe as mine was. So I very likely got a compromised immune system and some amount of toxicity passed down from my parents. And often it is the oldest child that gets the brunt of that passed down, and I am the oldest. So whatever it was, something compromised me from the time I was very young. I had food intolerances and food allergies from the time I was a baby. I tended to be pretty finicky around food. I also got a lot of ear infections as a toddler and was on quite a bit of antibiotics as a child. And as I got older, I just slowly kept adding on to my list of food allergies. Through my childhood, I just kept getting allergic to more and more different foods. I would also have these really strange illnesses where I would have 24 hours of a very high fever and then come back and be totally normal. So it wasn't like a classic virus or cold. You know how that kind of tends to play out, like a flu or a cold. It would be these very intense high fevers that would just last for 24 hours and then go away. I also showed signs of kind of obsessive compulsive tendencies from the time I was a child, like wanting to line things up a certain way and always having to do things in a certain order, just some kind of compulsive tendencies with my behavior. And that increased into my adolescence, where I just got a lot of social anxiety, a lot of generalized anxiety, and I really started to identify with that. I really started to identify with being anxious, with being mentally ill, as a part of my identity because that's the only thing I knew to do with it. I was put on anti-anxiety medications as a young adult, and I just thought that that's part of who I was, how my brain was wired. As I got into young adulthood, I did a lot of partying, used substances, and at the same time had a very high level of productivity. I tended to be a bit of a perfectionist and was very hard on myself, really doing a lot of high stress studies and jobs through the week and then partying a lot on the weekends. So I just expended a lot of energy all the time. Went through graduate school. And it was during this time when I just noticed more things come up from the baseline of just like allergy symptoms and anxiety. That was kind of my norm. I started getting allergic reactions to foods that I wasn't allergic to, right? I just started randomly reacting to foods. And I started getting recurrent yeast infections, recurrent vaginal bacterial infections, recurrent UTIs. I was just on rounds and rounds and rounds of antibiotics and antifungals and just could not get rid of them. They would just always come back. And meanwhile, I would get hives and flushing all over my face. That was starting to come up and be really scary. My lips would swell up randomly. So I'd had this baseline of kind of moderate health issues, mental and physical, through my whole life. But in my early 20s, it really started escalating. And I didn't know how to explain it. I didn't know what was going on. It started to get to the point where when I would eat, my throat would feel mucousy and swollen pretty much no matter what I ate. I was getting really severe acid reflux, like very, very painful stomach aches. I started getting a lot of autonomic nervous system issues too, with like my cardiovascular and respiratory system. So I started finding that my heart would just race out of the blue, or I would lie down to rest and my heart rate would go up, right? It would have like an opposite reaction. I got a lot of palpitations, a lot of skipped heartbeats, like heart flutter sensations, and I started getting air thirst, which was really, really scary. It would be like I felt like I was breathing as deeply as I could, but I wasn't getting enough oxygen. So I was having this sensation of suffocation quite often. I also was just getting more and more fatigued. I had really gotten into high intensity exercise as a young adult, and I just could not do it anymore. I used to jog a lot, and I just couldn't do it. I just felt weak and exhausted. I would get home from work, and I would just crash on my bed. And I just kind of remember feeling at the time like, well, I guess maybe this is just what things are like now. I just have enough energy for work and that's it. I can't really do anything else, and maybe I just need to accept that. I also just felt generally kind of bloated and inflamed. I started gaining weight, even though my eating habits hadn't changed. I was exercising less, and so I kind of chalked it up to that. But then my menstruation was getting extremely painful. I had been on birth control for many years, and I had tried to go off it to see if that would help my recurrent vaginal infections I was getting. And when my menstruation came back from kind of being suppressed on birth control pills, it came with a vengeance. I was getting intense pain. I remember thinking to myself, I wonder if someone can die from pain. It was so bad. I would vomit, I would have diarrhea, I was in extreme pain for the couple days that my flow was the heaviest. And it was finally at this time that I went to an allergist, because I would go to the doctors and they would just look at me like I was crazy, and I would just start having a panic attack and crying and leaving, because I felt like maybe I was having a psychotic break, that I was a hypochondriac, imagining all these symptoms, because there were so many in so many different areas of my body, and I just couldn't explain what was happening to me. But it was getting to a really critical point where not only was I having increased anxiety and panic and feeling like I couldn't breathe, but I started getting this sensation of like impending doom, where I started just feeling like at any moment I could just die. Like I felt like I was at the edge of death at every moment. And it was really hard to explain, because it was a very psychological phenomenon, but it was extremely visceral, of just this sense of my body being like, you're about to die, you're about to die, you're about to die. And I just could not get that sensation or thought out of my head. And so again, finally I found this allergist who had just been to a conference where they were talking about mast cell disorders. And she looked at my, umbrella of symptoms that I was coming in with, and she saw my presentation, and she said, I think you have mast cell activation syndrome. And I had never heard of this. This was just starting to be talked about, in like 2016 when I was diagnosed. It's a very new disorder. It's kind of developed as a phenomenon of, really poor microbiome health that is developing nowadays. And so it's a very new condition. And so people were just starting to talk about this, and she gave me the diagnosis. But she didn't know how to treat it, right? She just told me, here's all these antihistamines. Let's just see if we can suppress your symptoms as much as possible. So I was on several different antihistamines at high doses. I was taking Benadryl like at least several times a week, sometimes every day, to try to suppress my symptoms. And it helped for a little bit. Like there was a couple months where I noticed like, wow, I don't feel as panicked anymore, right? I don't quite have this sense of impending doom that I used to feel. And so I was like, oh, okay, the diagnosis must be correct, and these medications must be working. So I was feeling really good about it, but I just kind of, you know, had resigned myself to like, well, I guess I just have an autoimmune disease, and this is just how it's going to be for the rest of my life, because no one was giving me options. She told me, like, you're probably going to have this forever, we don't know how to treat it. It's just something people get. You're just going to have to take the antihistamines and hope for the best, basically. But the problem is that the medication stopped working. So, for about 6 months, I was just trying to go these conventional routes after I was diagnosed. I was just trying to take as many of these antihistamines as possible, but the symptoms started to creep back. And again, they were just so debilitating. I realized that I wasn't going to be able to keep working if things were going how they were because I was having extreme symptoms when I would be at work in the middle of the day. And I was having to call in sick a lot. I was having to leave early. It was starting to really become a problem. And that's when I just stumbled on the world of alternative medicine. And I actually stumbled on it because I was looking for alternatives to psychiatric medications because I had weaned myself off of anti anxiety medications because I didn't like some of the side effects that they had given me, but I felt like my mental health was at a point where I couldn't keep doing the work I was doing. And so I was looking for natural alternatives to anti anxiety medications. And I was coming across the world of herbalism, and I met an herbalist who was going to help me with my mental health symptoms using herbs. And I started talking to her about more of what was going on. And she said, "Oh, you can treat histamine and mast cell disorders through nutrition, right?" And I said, "No, no one's told me this before." And so she was like, "Yeah, Google low histamine diet." And she was like, "I'm not an expert, but here's some information. Like, go explore this." So I did, and I started finding this whole other world. And I decided in the research that I was doing that what I really needed to do was not just any kind of low histamine diet. I needed to do a whole foods low histamine diet. So what I did first was I stopped eating processed food, I stopped eating sugar, I stopped eating refined carbohydrates. I switched to just whole grains and vegetables and meat, basically, and fruit, and then unprocessed, like traditional fats, coconut oil, olive oil, butter, things like that. And it was really hard for me. It was so hard for me because I was a sugar addict my whole life. I ate sweets every day. I love sugar. I love pastries. I didn't think I could live without it. My mom had called me a carb packer, right? Like I was the kind of person that would have bread and pasta, right? I would just have one of the others. I loved carbs. I loved sugar. And I realized that I had to change. I had to give that up. I didn't feel like I had a choice. I felt like I was going to die if I didn't, or I was going to be bedbound, housebound. So I made the transition, and within a week, I got extremely sick for about a week. And this was my first wave of detox, and I just decided to write it out. It felt like I got a really bad virus, is what it felt like, and I didn't know enough at the time to really know what was going on. But I was just like, I'm just gonna stick to what I'm doing and write it out. And I did get better. And what I found on the other side of that was that my reactivity had really changed. Within a month of switching to a whole foods diet, I was still reacting a lot, but it was more specific. I didn't have this like low level of constant symptomology anymore. It was like a couple times a day I would have these reactions to things. I would have symptoms come up, but they had gotten kind of narrower, if that makes sense. They had gotten more specific, more acute, and I also had even worse energy. I was more tired, more weak. But because my symptoms had shifted so much and I wasn't experiencing so many different symptoms per day, I was more experiencing a few acute symptoms per day, I knew that I was onto something. So I decided to keep going. And what I did was I started weaning off my antihistamine medications because what I started reading was that antihistamine medications, although they can help in the short term, they actually exacerbate your symptoms in the long term. They make your histamine reactivity worse in the long term. So I just started slowly weaning off my antihistamine medications and my anti-acid medications, and I would only use the Benadryl occasionally if I was having a really severely reactive day. That was kind of my crisis medication that I would still use. I still used it for quite some time, just when I was really, really reactive. I also started realizing that I had to figure out my nervous system, because taking away the crutches, I also got off all substances at this point. I had been, pretty heavy marijuana user and drinker, used a lot of alcohol and other recreational drugs, and I got completely sober. And I realized that there was this whole well of nervous system dysregulation that I had been putting band-aids over my whole life. And I realized, as I stopped being able to go out to eat and I stopped being able to go out drinking with friends, I realized that I really had to change my sense of who I was. Because as I said before, I had really identified with being like mentally ill, right? And just kind of sickly, and just that was just who I was and what I was going to have to deal with. And I had to really change that around and really open up to a new way of thinking and feeling about myself. And so I started doing things that I had always kind of like poo-pooed before, as like, oh, those don't really work. That's not really real. So I started meditating. And I started working on nervous system regulating practices. I started doing tension and trauma releasing exercises. I started connecting more spiritually. I started doing spiritual work, which I had always avoided before, thinking it was, silly and corny. And I really shifted my mindset. I really decided I had to completely change my whole lifestyle to be focused on health and healing, and that relationships I lost and activities I loved to do and things I loved to do before that, I just had to let it all go. I had to let it all go and start from scratch and rebuild myself and my life in a totally new way. And so all of that was happening at the same time. Switching to this whole foods diet, really changing my identity, really changing my daily practices. After 6 months, I realized I had to take things to the next level because I was no longer progressing. I was kind of stuck where I was. So I switched to a paleo whole foods diet. And I was still doing mostly low histamine at this point, although my activity was starting to go down a bit. So I had more variety of foods I was able to eat at this point, but not very much. And after I took grains out of my diet, and so I was on a not only no sugar but very low starch diet. I only had a few starchy vegetables I would still occasionally eat, like yams. And like parsnips, just like a few starchy vegetables I still had in, but I took out all the other starch, all the grains. I was eating a lot of rice and like quinoa and things like that, even though I had taken out gluten already. And this triggered a severe detox. This was my wave 2 of detox. I could barely walk. I was so weak and so exhausted. My muscles just like didn't work for a while. I had gotten extremely pale, extremely underweight. I was about 110 pounds, which was the lightest I had ever been. And it was really hard. I had to really trust that I was still on the right track. If I had given up every time I went through a detox, I would never have gotten better. So I just had to trust that I was on the right path because of the changes I had seen and the things I was reading. And I did that for another 6 months. And things did stabilize. I got a little bit of my strength back. I recovered a little bit. I was still could like not walk more than a block though at this point. But I did notice that my histamine reactivity had continued to go down little by little. I wasn't as reactive day to day. Now it was more like several times a week I would have big reactions instead of once a day, right? So it was just slowly continuing to stabilize. It was at that point, so a little over a year before I first made the shift, that I was ready to do a really intensive gut reset. So I did a version of the GAPS intro diet, and I still use this protocol with my clients because it is so, so effective. So you basically go through this very intensive protocol, and I have a lot of videos and resources about this and an online course all about this, but to completely rebuild the lining of the gut and to take out any last bits of food that might be causing inflammation in the gut or feeding pathogenic overgrowth of bacteria. And at this point, even though there was just a few little starchy things, like, and a little bit of fruit that I was eating at this point, just taking those out and just drinking the soups for all my meals, this took me through a third wave of detox. And so this was probably the worst, honestly, because it felt like my legs were filled. What I described it as was my legs and my arms were filled with hot jello, is what it felt like. I was weak, I felt like loose and wiggly, and I just had these like streams of heat and tingling like going down my limbs. I was going through such an intense detox, and this lasted for several weeks. I was so tired. I had so much brain fog. I could barely think. I couldn't read. I couldn't comprehend anything. I had to take time off work because I was too weak to even push the gas pedal down in my car. My mom had to help me do the dishes. I had to ask for help at stores to pick cans and bottles off the shelf if I was trying to buy like coconut oil. I couldn't even lift a jar of coconut oil off the shelf. It was very intense. But again, if I had given up, I would never have gotten better. I had to let my body go through this to heal. And what happened is several months into this gut reset diet, I started noticing profound change. I started noticing extremely decreased reactivity to food. I started expanding my diet into lots of foods that would cause me, that were very healthy and good for a gut reset, but I was too reactive to eat before, right? Things like seafood, things like avocados, things like eggs. I was too reactive to eat those before, even though they were great healthy foods for a gut reset, but now I couldn't tolerate them. I was having far less reactions to food, and my strength started increasing. I actually started going on hikes again. I could walk more than a mile now. I also started gaining weight. I actually gained about 15 pounds in under a month. My body was finally absorbing and utilizing the nutrients I was giving it. And I felt so much better. I felt this was the best I had felt since I first started getting sick. And at that point, I started living a much more normal life. I still had to be really careful of my energy. I could not exercise still. If I exercised, where I would get my heart rate up for more than a few minutes, I would just be totally just wrecked for like the rest of the day. But I could walk now. I could walk. I could go on hikes, mild hikes. And I was just living pretty normally day to day. I wasn't nearly as reactive to scents and chemicals and stimulation, right? I was living much more normally. I ended up doing a parasite cleanse around this time with herbs and passed a lot of parasites. I'll talk about that in another video in more detail, but that also I noticed really helped my symptoms at this point. I hadn't been strong enough to do it before this, that's why I hadn't done it before, but at this point I was strong enough to do a cleanse like that, and it really helped. But, again, about 6 months after this point where I was living a lot more normally, but still having to be really careful with my energy and still having flare ups occasionally. I was still definitely having maybe a flare up every couple weeks. I realized that I had reached a plateau again, right, where I wasn't seeing any healing progress anymore. I was kind of stuck where I was. And so at this point, I reached out to a naturopath to get tested for heavy metals. Because often when you start seeing progress and then no progress, there's something deeper going on that we're missing. So I ended up getting tested for heavy metal toxicity, and it turned out I had a huge amount of lead in my body. And I'm not sure how I got that, but it is possible that I was exposed to it when a house was being remodeled that I was living in when I was a toddler that had just been stuck in my body. So I ended up going through IV chelation therapy, which is controversial. Not everyone recommends that, and not everyone is strong enough to tolerate it. It's what I chose to do. And I went through my fourth big detox. I got very sick again, very tired again. I got a flare up of my dysautonomia, the autonomic nervous system dysregulation. I got very weak, very low blood pressure, very lightheaded again, and couldn't really do much for a while. But once the chelation processed out of my system, I had an incredible surge of energy. I had never had this much energy in my life, and I had never felt so mentally healthy in my life. It was like a cloud dissipated and the sun came out for the first time I could really ever remember. It was a huge change. And so, like I said, I had been healing in these stages over the last several years, but then this was like one of the last big pieces, was getting the metals out. And at this point, my exercise intolerance had totally gone away, and I started strength training and powerlifting and bodybuilding, which I am still really into now because it felt so incredible to be so strong and capable in my body again, and really more than I ever had felt before. And I pretty much could eat whatever I wanted at that point. But, because I wasn't reacting to foods at all, really, anymore. I would have an occasional, very small flare up now, like maybe once every month or two at this point. Very, very small. But it wasn't really correlated to anything I was doing anymore. It was just kind of like a nervous system memory at this point. Um, and I started looking into why my body had been holding onto metals for so many years. And I learned about oxalates, which are a compound in some plants that some people cannot metabolize, that some people cannot break down and do not flush out of their body very easily. And when people have heavy metal toxicity, often they are intolerant to oxalates because oxalates bind to minerals and to heavy metals. So it makes you not only not absorb minerals very well, which would explain some of the nutrient deficiencies I had been struggling with. Um, and it also would explain why my body had been holding on to heavy metals. So even though I could have expanded my diet a lot at this point, I decided to take most plants out of my diet. I had been eating a low carb ketogenic style diet, for years now at this point, but I decided to take most of the plants out of my diet at this point and do a mostly carnivore diet to try to get as many oxalates out of my diet as I could, do a very low oxalate diet. And within a few months, this triggered my fifth major detox. Now, it didn't debilitate me like other ones had. I was strong enough at this point that I pretty much lived my life normally through it, but I got intense rashes all over my body. I started having like water diarrhea and cloudy, smelly urine. That's how the oxalates come out. And they come out through the skin as well. So I started having major oxalate dumping. My body started getting all these oxalates out of my body. And this actually triggered a second wave of lead toxicity because all the lead that the oxalates had been holding on to, the chelation that I had gone through, hadn't been able to get out before. And so I ended up going through another round of heavy metal chelation, which again is controversial. Not everyone would recommend it. It's what I chose to do. And at that point, again, I felt better than I had ever felt. And now I do eat a more varied diet now. I will cycle in and out of more of a carnivore diet and eating more plants because I don't break down the oxalates in the plants and I don't want to accumulate heavy metals again. So I just cycle it, and I just, live a really normal life now. I hike up mountains, I do bodybuilding, I travel, I'm just intentional with my diet. But like I said, I can kind of eat pretty much whatever I want. I only eat whole foods, I don't eat processed foods, but I'm much more flexible now. Yeah, I mean, there are still things that I'm always working on and tweaking, but overall, I live a very healthy life and I have such a passion for having other people find their own road to health. So, I wanted to tell some more details of my story because as I said in the beginning, everyone has a unique journey, but there are some similarities, and it can be helpful to hear what other people did, what other people experienced, to just normalize some of the process and to make sure you know that chronic illness is not a life sentence, no matter how serious what you're dealing with is. So I hope this was helpful to explain a little bit more of my story. Be sure to subscribe to my channel. I try to post tips once or twice a week with new videos. So, all right, take care, everyone.